She was 71 years old when the knock came, 3 slow raps against a door she had not repainted in decades. Her name was Eleanor Prescott, though most folks in the valley just called her Miss Ellie now, the schoolteacher who never married, the woman who kept a lantern burning in her window on nights when the wind screamed down from the ridge for no reason anyone could name. She set down her needlework and rose from the rocking chair, joints protesting the way they always did these days, and crossed the plank floor toward the door. 50 years is a long time to wait for anything. 50 years is long enough to convince yourself you have stopped waiting at all. She opened the door, expecting the Hollis boy come to return her borrowed plow horse. Or maybe the preacher checking on her again since the fever took half the town the spring before. What she found instead was an old man standing in the amber wash of late afternoon light. Hat in his weathered hands, silver hair catching the sun like frost on a fence rail. She did not recognize the stoop of his shoulders or the deep lines carved into his face by sun and sorrow, and years she knew nothing about. But she knew his eyes. Those eyes had not changed in 50 years. Not one shade of that particular blue-gray that used to catch the morning light over the wheat fields when he was 22 years old and full of promises he swore he would keep. Her hand found the doorframe before her knees could betray her. The last time she had seen those eyes, they were wet with tears he refused to let fall, staring back at her from atop a borrowed cavalry horse as he rode toward a war that swallowed most of the boys who left the valley that spring of 1863. He never wrote after the 3rd year. She told herself he was dead 100 different times in 100 different ways, buried in some unmarked field in a state she had never seen, his name lost to history the way so many names were lost in those years. She built a whole life around that grief, teaching other women's children their letters, tending her father's land after he passed, letting the seasons turn one into the next until the war itself became a story old men told in the mercantile, something that happened to other people's sons. Now here he stood. Thomas Whitfield stood on her porch in the golden light of an ordinary afternoon, and for a long moment neither of them said a word, because there are some silences too heavy for speech to carry. Behind her, in the small front room, the kettle she had set to boil for her own solitary supper began to whistle, thin and far away, and she barely heard it over the sound of her own heartbeat. Before she could fully understand what she was seeing, her mind slipped backward, unbidden, to the last spring before he left, to the two of them sitting on her father's fence rail, shelling peas into a tin bucket while the whole valley smelled of turned earth and clover. He had asked her that spring, clumsy and earnest, whether she would wait for him if the fighting called him away. And she remembered laughing at the seriousness in his young face before answering that she would wait 100 years if she had to, never once imagining the number might come so close to true. That memory arrived and passed in the space of a single held breath, and then she was simply an old woman standing in her own doorway, staring at an old man who had once been that boy. It was Thomas who broke the silence first, his voice rougher than she remembered, worn down by decades of things she could not yet imagine. "I know I have no right to be standing here," he said, "and I know 50 years is longer than any woman should be asked to forgive." She wanted to be angry. She had rehearsed anger in her mind 1,000 times over the years, imagined the exact words she would say if he ever walked back into her life, sharp words meant to wound the way his silence had wounded her, words sharpened on lonely nights when the wind rattled the shutters and she lay awake, wondering whether he had died alone in some field she would never see. But standing there watching him twist his hat in his hands like a nervous boy of 22 rather than a man past 70, all she felt was the ground shifting beneath 5 decades of careful, practiced forgetting. "Where have you been?" she finally managed to ask, and her voice cracked on the last word like dry wood underfoot. He did not answer right away. Instead, he looked past her, into the little house she had built her life inside, at the faded curtains and the worn Bible on the side table and the single chair pulled up close to the fire, and something in his face folded inward, as though he was only now understanding the true size of what he had taken from her by staying silent so long. "Might I come in?" he asked, and there was no demand in it. Only the quiet hope of a man who expected to be turned away and had decided he deserved it if she chose to. She stood aside without quite deciding to, the way a person moves in a dream, and Thomas Whitfield stepped over her threshold for the first time in 50 years. He sat where she gestured, in the chair across from her own, and for a long while the only sound in the little house was the settling of the fire and the wind testing the shutters outside, patient as it had always been. Finally she asked him again, steadier this time. "Where have you been, Thomas?" he told her then, staring into the low flames rather than at her face, "about the field hospital in Tennessee where a shell burst too close and took most of the hearing from his left ear and left his hands shaking for the better part of a year afterward." He described the hospital tent itself in more detail than she wanted, the smell of carbolic acid and unwashed wool, the sound of other men calling out names in their sleep, names of wives and mothers and sweethearts, and how he had lain there through the worst of his own fever, certain he would call out her name too, and somehow shame himself in front of strangers. He told her about the 2 years he spent in a boarding house in Nashville, too broken and too ashamed to write a woman he no longer believed deserved a cripple for a husband. A man who flinched at loud noises and woke most nights, certain he was still lying in the mud at Chickamauga, listening for the whistle of shells that never came. He told her about the day he finally decided he was well enough to come home, and how he stood at the train station with a ticket in his hand for 6 straight hours before he tore it up and walked away, because he had convinced himself she had surely married some whole and unbroken man by then, some man who could give her the life he no longer believed himself capable of giving. That conviction, once planted, grew roots deep enough to hold him for half a century. He described that train platform in more detail than she expected, the cold iron bench he sat on, the way the ticket agent watched him with growing suspicion as the hours passed, the 3 separate trains that pulled in and pulled out again, while he sat frozen between 2 futures he could not bring himself to choose between. By the time the sun set that day, he told her, he had convinced himself that walking away was the kinder choice. A gift he was giving her, rather than a theft he was committing, and it took him nearly 50 years to understand how thoroughly he had lied to himself in that one cold hour. He told her about drifting west after that, working cattle drives through Kansas and Colorado, mining camps in the high country of Montana, where the winters nearly killed him twice, because he could not bear the thought of settling anywhere that reminded him of the boy he used to be. He spoke of one particular winter in a mining camp above a town called Alder Gulch, where the temperature dropped so far below freezing that the men slept 3 to a bunk just to share warmth, and how he had lain awake those long nights doing arithmetic in his head, counting the years since he had last seen her, watching the number climb higher each season like a debt he could never hope to repay. In between the cattle drives and the mining camps, he told her there were long stretches of nothing much at all, seasons spent doing odd carpentry work in towns whose names he had mostly forgotten, seasons spent recovering from a broken leg in a boarding house outside Laramie, seasons spent simply riding from one horizon to the next because standing still too long left him too much time to think about the gate he had ridden away from. He told her about a preacher in a small Colorado town who once asked him, after Sunday service, why a capable man like himself had never settled down and raised a family, and how he had given some vague answer about the wandering life suiting him, and how he had walked out of that church afterward and sat by the river for the rest of the afternoon turning the true answer over and over in his mind, until the sun went down. He told her about the letter he wrote her every single year, always on the same date, the anniversary of the morning he rode away from her father's gate, 50 letters in total across 50 years, and how every single one of them ended up burned in whatever fireplace happened to be nearest, because he could never find the courage to walk them to a post office. I told myself burning them was a mercy, he said, his voice barely above the crackle of the fire. I told myself you were better off believing me dead than knowing I was alive somewhere and simply too much of a coward to come home to you. Why now? She asked him. And this time there was no crack in her voice, only a quiet, exhausted honesty that surprised even her. Because I am dying, Ellie, he said, and the words landed between them like stones dropped into still water, spreading rings outward that touched every corner of the small room. The doctor in Cheyenne gave him perhaps a year, maybe less, something wrong with his heart that no medicine in that country could fix. Some slow failing the doctor described with words Thomas only half understood and did not care to understand further, because the diagnosis itself had told him everything he needed to know. He said that when the doctor gave him that news, sitting in a cold examination room with rain hammering the window, the only thought in his head, clear and sudden as a struck match, was her face. Not the town he had built a small reputation in over the last 20 years. Not the men he rode with. Not even his own life. Only her face as it had looked the last morning he saw her, standing at her father's gate with her hand raised against the morning sun. I decided I would rather spend whatever time is left looking at those eyes one more time than spend it a coward hiding from the only truth that ever mattered to me, he said. And finally, he looked up from the fire and met her gaze directly. She should have shut the door on him the moment she recognized what he was asking of her. Or so the practical, self-protective part of her insisted, the part built over 50 years of careful independence, the part that had survived his absence precisely by refusing to need anyone the way she had once needed him. Instead, she found herself reaching across the small space between their two chairs and taking his weathered hand in both of hers, the way she had done 1,000 times in her memory, but never once in 50 years of waking life. That first night they sat at her kitchen table until the candle burned down to almost nothing, and she learned the shape of the man he had become. A man carved differently by war and time and loneliness, but built, underneath all the new scars, from the same stubborn kindness she remembered from the boy who used to walk 3 miles out of his way just to see her home safely from church. He learned that she had turned down 3 proposals over the years, decent men, hard-working men. Men who would have given her a comfortable life. And each time she told herself it was because the men were not right for her. Though some quiet corner of her heart always knew the truth was simpler and more painful than that. I kept waiting for a letter, she admitted that first night, staring at the candle rather than at him. Even after I stopped believing you were alive, some fool part of me kept waiting for a letter. He said nothing to that, only bowed his head, and she understood without being told exactly how much that silence cost him. He stayed only an hour longer that first night, insisting on taking a room above the mercantile in town rather than presuming further on her hospitality, and she watched him walk down the frozen lane toward town with his hat pulled low, an old man's careful walk where once she remembered a young man's easy stride, and she sat by her window long after his shape disappeared into the dark, unable to convince herself the whole afternoon had not been some vivid trick of a lonely woman's imagination. The weeks that followed unfolded slowly, the way healing always does. 2 people relearning how to speak a language they once knew fluently, but had grown rusty from decades of disuse. He was at her door most mornings, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, offering to mend whatever needed mending, and she came to recognize the particular rhythm of his knock, the way she once recognized his whistle carrying across the wheat fields as a girl. He fixed the hinge on the barn door that had squeaked since her father died 15 years before. oiled it careful and slow with his shaking hands until it swung silent as a held breath, and when he finished, he stood there a long moment, just listening to the quiet, as though that small repaired sound was the first real thing he had fixed in 50 years of drifting. He mended her fences and reset a leaning post that had bothered her for 2 winters, and he did it all without asking for thanks. The way a man works when the work itself is the only apology he knows how to offer. One particular afternoon in late September, while he was replacing a rotted board on her porch steps, she brought out 2 cups of coffee and sat on the top step watching him work, and he told her almost as an aside about a woman in Bozeman who had once nursed him through a fever and asked him to stay on and marry her, and how he had refused, not out of loyalty he felt he deserved credit for, but simply because some stubborn part of him could not picture a future that did not somehow circle back to this valley. She caught herself laughing again, really laughing, at his terrible jokes about growing old and gray, the kind of laughter she had almost forgotten how to produce, the kind that came from somewhere low in the chest rather than politely from the throat. In the evenings, when his hands had stopped shaking enough to hold a cup steady, he told her about the places he had seen, the wide Montana sky and the mining towns that rose and emptied within a single season. And she told him about the children she had taught over the decades, some of them grandparents themselves now, and how strange it felt to have poured so much of herself into other people's families while her own house stayed quiet and empty. "I used to imagine you had a whole life somewhere," she confessed one evening in early autumn, sitting on the porch steps while he stood at the rail watching the sun go down behind the ridge where he would one day be buried, though neither of them knew that yet. A wife, children, a whole life that simply never included coming back for me. "There was never anyone else," he said, and his voice was steady in a way it rarely was when he spoke of the war. "Not because I was loyal in any way that deserves credit, because I never once stopped seeing your face when I closed my eyes, and no other woman's face ever had a chance against that." She wept then, quietly, and he did not try to comfort her with words, only sat beside her on the step and let her lean her head against his shoulder the way she had done exactly once before, 50 years earlier. The night before he left for the war, neither of them understood the true cost of yet. Her younger sister Margaret, who had married a rancher and moved 2 valleys over decades before, came to visit that October and sat with Eleanor in the kitchen while Thomas worked outside, and she asked, not unkindly, whether Eleanor had considered what it meant to open her heart again to a man who had already once broken it through silence. "I have considered little else," Eleanor told her, watching Thomas through the window as he split firewood with slow, careful strokes, pausing often to catch his breath in a way that frightened her more than she let herself admit. "But I would rather feel this and lose him again than spend whatever years I have left wondering what I refused out of pride." Margaret said nothing further on the matter after that, only reached across the table and squeezed her sister's hand. And from that day on, she never again questioned Thomas Whitfield's place at Eleanor's table. There was a Sunday that November when Thomas walked with her to church for the first time, and the 2 of them sat together in the same pew her family had occupied for 3 generations, and she felt the eyes of the whole congregation on the back of her neck the entire service. Curious and unable to help themselves, but she found she did not mind it the way she once might have. After the service, old Mr. Holloway, who had lost his own son at Shiloh, approached Thomas on the church steps and gripped his hand for a long moment without speaking, and Eleanor watched something pass between the 2 old men that needed no words at all. The particular understanding shared by those who had survived a war that took so many others. Walking home that afternoon, Thomas told her that moment on the church steps had done something for him that 50 years of solitude never managed, some small unlocking of a door he had kept bolted since Tennessee, and she squeezed his arm and said nothing. only let the quiet weight of his gratitude settle between them like an unspoken vow. But death does not wait politely for love to finish catching up on lost time, and by the time the first snow fell that winter, Thomas had grown thin and gray around the mouth, his breath coming shorter with each passing week, his steps slower on the walk up from town each morning. He tried to hide it from her at first, the way proud men do, making light of his winded climb up her porch steps, blaming the cold or his boots or his age, but she had spent 50 years learning to read the things people tried to hide, first in her students and later in herself, and she saw the truth of it plain enough. "You are getting worse," she said to him one gray morning in January, not as a question, but as a statement she needed him to confirm. He did not deny it. That was the morning she told him to bring his few belongings from the room above the mercantile and stay in the house, propriety be damned, because she had already lost 50 years to caution, and she was not fool enough to lose whatever remained to it as well. The town talked, of course, the way small towns always do, but Eleanor Prescott had spent 5 decades being talked about for the strange, lonely habit of never marrying, and she found she no longer had the patience to care what new shape their talk took now. She nursed him through those final months, the way she imagined she would have nursed him 50 years earlier. Had the war never come and stolen those years from them both, boiling broths and changing linens and sitting up through the worst of his difficult nights, when his breath came ragged and his mind sometimes wandered back to muddy fields in Tennessee. There were nights he called out names she did not recognize, men he had served beside, men who had not survived the years she had spent believing he had not survived either, and she would take his hand and speak low and steady until his breathing eased and the present slowly reclaimed him. One such night in late January, the worst of the winter so far, he woke shouting a name she later learned belonged to a young corporal from Ohio who had died in his arms the same week the shell took his hearing, and after he calmed, she sat with him until dawn while he told her, haltingly, about the promise he had made that dying boy to carry word to his mother. A promise he had broken along with every other promise from that terrible year, and how the weight of that particular failure had followed him longer and heavier than almost any other. The next morning, though his strength was failing him more each week, he insisted she help him write a letter to that mother, if the woman was even still living. And Eleanor spent 3 days tracking the family through old Army records. A sympathetic clerk in Cheyenne agreed to search on their behalf, and when the letter finally went out, carried this time all the way to its destination rather than burned in some forgotten fireplace. Thomas wept for the first time since he had arrived at her door. Not from grief alone, but from the particular relief of a debt finally settled after 50 years of carrying it silently. That was the moment, she told herself later, when she understood the two of them were not simply mending a broken engagement, but somehow mending every unfinished thing the war had left scattered behind it, one small repair at a time. On the clearer nights, the ones where his mind stayed present and his breath came easier, they talked for hours by the fire, filling in the shape of 50 missing years, and sometimes he would take her hand and simply hold it without speaking, as though the holding itself was a kind of conversation neither of them needed words for anymore. He asked her once, near the end, sitting wrapped in quilts by the fire, with the February wind moaning soft outside the window, whether she regretted letting him back through that door after everything he had cost her. Not for one single day, she told him, and meant every word of it, and something in his face eased when he heard it. The way a man's face eases when a debt he believed unpayable is finally forgiven in full. There was one particular object between them, small and easy to overlook, that carried the whole weight of those 50 years inside it. A plain silver thimble her mother had given her. The one Thomas had slipped into his coat pocket the morning he rode away, promising to carry it safely through the war and return it to her finger himself. He had carried it every single day of those 50 years, through field hospitals and mining camps and every cold night on the trail. And on one of those clear evenings by the fire, he finally drew it from an inside pocket, worn smooth now from half a century of handling, and pressed it back into her palm without a word. She wore it on a thin chain around her neck from that evening onward, and though neither of them spoke of it directly again, they both understood it had become something larger than a thimble, a small silver proof that some promises, however delayed, are kept in the end. She remembered the morning her mother had first given her that thimble, years before the war, pressing it into her palm with the quiet instruction that a woman ought to always have one true thing that belonged only to her. Something no husband or hardship could take away, and she had never imagined that same small object would end up traveling half a continent and back again, carried through battlefields and mining camps by a man who could not bring himself to carry a single letter the same distance. As February deepened, his good days grew fewer, and on the days he could still manage it, they would sit together on the porch, wrapped in every quilt the house owned, watching the wheat fields lie dormant and silver under a thin crust of snow. And he told her once that those fields looked exactly the same as the morning he rode away, as though 50 years had simply folded shut around a single unbroken view. "Perhaps that is why I came back here, and nowhere else," he said, his breath fogging pale in the cold air. "Some part of me always understood that whatever I was looking for only existed in this one particular view of this one particular field. I searched half a continent for something I never lost in the first place," he added, his voice barely above the wind. "It was always right here, waiting behind this one gate, all along." He passed on a quiet morning in late February, snow falling soft and silent outside the window, the fire burned down to embers, her hand wrapped around his until the very last breath left him, unhurried and gentle as a held note finally allowed to fade. She buried him on the ridge overlooking the wheat fields, the same fields he had ridden past on his way to war 50 years before. The same golden stretch of land that had framed him in her doorway the afternoon he finally came home, and she planted wildflowers over the grave that bloomed every spring after that, stubborn and bright against the dark soil, refusing every winter's attempt to erase them. Eleanor Prescott lived another 11 years after Thomas Whitfield died, and in all that time she never once regretted opening that door, not on the loneliest nights, not even in the raw grief of that first spring without him, when the wildflowers he never lived to see bloomed for the first time above his grave, and she sat beside them for the better part of an afternoon simply because she could not yet bring herself to walk away. People in town sometimes asked her, in the gentle prying way small towns have, whether those final months with a dying man were worth the fresh grief that followed his passing. Whether it might have been easier, kinder even, to have simply turned him away that first afternoon and kept her long-practiced peace intact. She thought often, in those 11 remaining years, of the letter from that corporal's mother, which arrived at her door nearly a year after Thomas passed, a short and gracious note thanking them both for finally bringing her son's last words home after all the decades of silence, and Eleanor kept that letter tucked inside her own Bible for the rest of her life, a small reminder that even the longest delayed kindness still finds its way to where it belongs eventually. She always gave them the same answer, quiet and certain as the turning of the seasons themselves, the thimble at her throat catching the light whenever she spoke it. "Love does not measure itself in years granted," she would say. "It measures itself in the courage to open the door at all, however late the knock arrives, however little time remains on the other side of it." And every spring, when the wildflowers rose again on the ridge above the wheat fields, she would climb the familiar path and sit a while beside the stone bearing his name, the thimble warm against her throat, and she would tell him, out loud and unashamed, that she would make the very same choice again, every single time, no matter how the story ended.